Welcome back, life science learners. In this segment, we're going to focus on the process of birth and what happens in terms of the development of that baby when the process of birth takes place. It's important for us to understand that birth can be natural or through a C-section. Let's get into the lesson and try and unpack that. Okay, so the process of birth is essentially the expulsion of a fully developed fetus, its surrounding membranes and the placenta from the uterus. So we often confuse birth as just the release of the baby. It's more than that, guys. So it's important that we understand that birth happens in different stages, which we will look at in a little while. So apart from just the expulsion of the baby, it is also the release of the membranes surrounding the baby, the placenta as well, from the mother. That is all part of the birthing process. So when we look at the process of birth, we can discuss firstly what is a vaginal delivery. It is essentially the birth of an offspring of mammals or babies in humans through the vagina, also called the birth canal. So humans have been able to deliver babies more recently through C-sections, as well as a natural process through the vagina called a vaginal delivery. But in the wild, animals naturally give birth through a vaginal delivery. Okay, cool. So let's look at the process of birth. The birth of a baby occurs approximately 280 days, which is about approximately 40 weeks after the beginning of a woman's last menstrual period, which is about 38 weeks after fertilization. So you'll find that the gestational period is about 40 weeks, but that happens often 2 weeks after the female has had her last period. And if you calculate that, it's 14 days when ovulation took place, plus the other 38 weeks, which gives you a total of 40 weeks for the process of complete development of a fetus. A few days before the birth, the baby moves in such a way that the head engages in the cervix. So we talk about the baby developing in the fetus, and towards the 38 weeks or close towards the end of pregnancy, that the baby starts moving into position. And that is very important for the type of delivery and the position of when a decision is made in terms of the type of delivery. So we know that naturally, and if all goes well, that the head engages in the cervix. So essentially the head points towards the cervix. So here if we look at, this is the uterus. If we're looking at the head, this is the cervix. We're seeing that the head now is in the position facing the cervix. So let's try and unpack the role of hormones in this and just try and understand what happens during the process of birth. So the brain is stimulated when the baby's head touches the cervix. So when the fetus moves into position, the head stimulates the lining of the cervix, and that stimulates an impulse to the brain to release a hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin is released from parts of the brain which cause the muscles lining the uterus to begin contracting. So we find that the brain releases the hormones called oxytocin, and oxytocin targets the muscle walls of the endometrium, causing the process of muscle contraction. This will then cause the baby to push against the cervix, causing it to stretch. So that causes the cervix to stretch, and the stretching of the cervix then causes nerve impulses to be sent back to the brain, and this further allows for the release of more oxytocin, stimulating greater contraction and more expulsion of the baby. So towards the end of the 40 weeks of gestation, we see that the levels of progesterone begin to drop. Remember that progesterone maintains pregnancy, and so we see that level decreasing. This also coincides with a rise in estrogen levels, which causes the uterine muscles to begin contracting. And this we refer to as false labor, and sometimes you would have heard the term Braxton Hicks contraction. So these are contractions that happen due to an increase in the levels of estrogen. This in turn stimulates the stretching of the uterine walls, which trigger the release of hormones oxytocin and further stimulates the contraction of the uterus. The process of birth, where it happens through the vaginal delivery, involves 3 different stages. During stage 1, we see the contraction and the dilation of the cervix. So the cervix contracts and dilates. We also see that in the second stage of it, there is the descent of the baby through the birth canal. And in this third stage, we see the delivery of the placenta. Let's take a closer look at these 3 stages. Stage 1 can last between 2 to 20 hours. And it is during this stage that we see that the strength or the intensity of the contraction of the uterine muscles gradually becomes closer together. So we find that these contractions start occurring when the mother experiences contractions of the uterus. They become more intense and more shorter and deeper as the baby moves into position. So we say that the intensity of these contractions increase. As the baby descends, the head fits into the pelvic girdle and the head thus engages. We say that the head now engages into the cervix, applying pressure and stimulating the neurons in the brain to be able to now stimulate more oxytocin, which further contracts the uterine muscles. There is a plug in the uterus between the uterus and the cervix that releases or breaks away. And when this plug breaks away, we say that there is a show. And this is a secretion of mucus that is released as the plug is released. And that show is often a positive indication that a female is going into labor. And we see that the cervix begins to dilate, and this has to dilate to about 10 centimeters for the baby to emerge. The amniotic sac will burst and the amniotic fluid is released. Before birth, the cervix and the cartilage of the pubic symphysis, so the joints between the pubic symphysis, the girdles, will soften up, and this will allow for the extension of the cervix. And this is brought about by the hormones oxytocin and relaxin. This is an image showing you the head engaging, and here's the plug that is going to release. And as this occurs, we find that the uterine muscles contract, and this further applies pressure on the baby, causing the baby to move into position. During the second stage, which we refer to as delivery, this is generally about 1 hour if there are no complications. This is when there are very strong contractions of the uterus and the baby starts to force through the birth canal. The baby generally comes out head first, and we say that the head emerges first. And when this emerges first, we call that process the crowning. So this process, as illustrated here, when the head emerges first and you see the cranium, is called crowning. After a short rest, the right and then the left shoulders are delivered. And so you'll find that the baby then comes out one shoulder at a time, and you see that gradually emerges out with the shoulders first, and then you'll find that the rest of the baby emerges. The umbilical cord is then clamped in 2 places to prevent the bleeding when it is cut. The procedure is generally painless as there are no nerves in the umbilical cord. After separation from the mother, the baby then will take its first breath, the lungs inflate, and the baby is able to take its first breath. And so here we're seeing that image showing you the crowning and then the shoulders moving through the birth canal. And finally, we have the third stage, which is about 10 to 15 minutes after the process when the baby is out, where we find there is a series of contractions of the uterus will continue, and then the placenta is detached from the uterine wall, and that placenta and the rest of the umbilical cord is pulled out and removed through the vagina, and that is known as the afterbirth. And so we see that the umbilical cord is pulled and this placenta detaches and is removed. And so this is what it looks like at the end of the process, and we see now the placenta along with the umbilical cord that has been released. So guys, that process is the process of birth and how the baby is delivered. You guys deserve a little break, and when we get back, we will look at a concept of contraception. Short break, and I'll see you at the end of that.